Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. On today's show, we have Jamal Michel, a skilled journalist with a unique ability to navigate and excel in diverse mediums. From politics to digital media and the intricate world of video game culture, Jamal's writing experience is both extensive and impressive. He has written for the Missouri Review, the Minnesota Review, Apogee Journal, I hope I'm saying that right, and Linden Avenue Journal, to name just a few. His insights have also been featured in some of the most reputable outlets in the industry, including NPR, The Washington Post, Polygon, Poynter, Wired, and The New York Times. His ability to critically analyze and articulate the nuances of our contemporary culture is truly unparalleled. And currently, Jamal serves as a communication specialist at Duke University, and I'm honored to call him a classmate and friend. Jamal, welcome to the show.
Dude, I don't know which Jamal you're introducing, but that was way too
That's
gracious.
you, man. That's you, man.
Whoa, no way, dude. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to finally be on.
Yeah, no, we've been wanting to do this, I think, since having two classes together. So this is awesome.
And then we got hit with hella homework and stuff, and oh well, there's school.
Yep, pretty much. That's how it goes. So it's fun because I know bits and pieces of your story, but I'm also going to learn along with the audience for this, so that it'll be fun. The first question I ask almost every guest is, how did you relate to religion the first 18 years of your life?
Oh my gosh, bro. That was really, so I grew up in a Muslim household. So I practiced Islam. I still identify as Muslim, but I saw somebody online put it in this really interesting way. They culturally identify, even though they don't practice as much, at the age that they're at now. So in my 30s right now, I still identify as Muslim. I don't practice it as thoroughly as I used to, but growing up, that was really all I knew. My mother remains the most orthodox, just straight edge Muslim, and that's a lot of what it was for me growing up, was making sure I was walking the line, and I was, being the best Muslim boy that I could be. Was constantly at my mosque. There's Friday prayer, and there's Sunday classes. There are weekends that boys are meant to spend the night at the mosque to refine their Islamic studies and all these things. I did that for years. Every Ramadan, we're the family that is showing up with extra goodies and snacks, and we're helping prepare the area for people to break their fast. We're helping clean up the prayer area. I was just constantly doing this stuff for those dozens of years. Oh my goodness. For all those years, I definitely, it was just all Islam, and it was really just following the rules and making sure I was listening to what my mother and her family were really telling me and guiding me. And it's interesting because my father, he used to identify as Catholic. Now he's sort of agnostic, maybe atheist. But growing up, he identified as Catholic, but would participate in all these different activities that we had. And I guess he was just doing that to appease my mom. But yeah, he did what he could, but he had his questions. And he's actually the reason why I grew up with the questions that I grew up with, the contradictions, observations, all of these different things. So he really ignited a fire early on.
It's interesting because, I can relate to it kind of, Christianity in my world was my world. There really wasn't a world outside it. And anything that was painted as the outside world was painted in pretty negative light. Did you have that same experience? Like, personally, were you scared of the outside world at all, or were you, it's interesting. You have this dynamic of a father who's Catholic. I wonder if that kind of made you maybe a little more open-minded early on.
It's so funny. It's interesting because my father wasn't a practicing Catholic. So I think religiously, he just wasn't into any of it. Islam or Catholicism. He really it didn't mesh well with him because he naturally had all of these questions that religion, for him at least, couldn't answer those questions. But to your point, it was a lot of fear. I was afraid of everything. Growing up, I was a really anxious kid. I was just afraid to try things, afraid to do things, afraid to ask to hang out with friends. Even when I got to the age when I'm like, okay, I really want to explore, I really want to do these things, I was too afraid to do it because of all the damnation, all of the taboo, associated with these things. I was really just scared and really sheltered. My mother was like a helicopter mom. So just trying to navigate that in my youth was a handful. And then also just trying to be as righteous as possible, so that way I didn't go to hell.
yeah, it's a hard line to toe when you're a developing mind and you're like, I don't understand the universe at all I'm being told is if I mess up, it's bad news forever. So
yeah, it's done. Yeah. It's over. Yeah. Exactly.
You mentioned this kind of kind of split that you kind of live in now between cultural background and religious identity. And so were you aware of that when you were younger? And if there was sort of the cultural identity of Muslim that was distinct from the religious identity, how did that shape your perspective of the world, or did that distinction not come till way later?
Oh, absolutely. It didn't come until way later. And I think, what helped going to college, like my undergraduate years when I was in Miami going to college, changed everything. It's almost too cliche. You go to college and you meet people and you learn things and all that jazz. That's literally what it was. But up to that point, it really strictly was, I identify as Muslim, and not culturally at all, because I didn't understand that nuance. But it was this is my identity. This is everything about me. I remember I used to wear the kufi, the hat, at school when I was a sophomore in high school during Ramadan. And now that I look back, I'm just I'm a very different person. I have a very different understanding of my relationship with my religion at this point. But yeah, there was no other way of living for me. It was everything I did, it was through the lens of Islam, and everything that I viewed in my life was through the lens of Islam. I was never going to smoke, never going to drink. I mean, now I still haven't smoked or drank anything but alcohol, but that's just personal at this point. It's a personal preference. But growing up, it was my religion says I'm not supposed to do this, and this is exactly what I'm going to stick to. I was deliberate about that, and I was trying to be as intentional as I could, especially with things like marriage and relationships and all of these hard line issues within my religion. I was this is how I'm going to live. This is how I'm going to navigate it. And high school and college changed that really quickly, because I met people who I didn't know it at the time, but because of my conversations with my father, it helped me relate to people who I thought I would have been appalled by, right? I would have scoffed at, because I was on my high horse growing up, on my religious high horse. But I meet these people who are all fascinating and complicated and nuanced, just like people are. And really, it begins to open my eyes to just how people are, especially outside of the religious world. So yeah, definitely later in life is when I guess my cultural identity began to really take shape.
Do you think you had any kind of cultural identity, or was it very religious? Was it very because for me, my, growing up Christian, there really wasn't, you could almost call us uncultured, there was almost no real culture to have. I'm wondering if you had that, or if you were kind of able to even develop any kind of cultural identity.
I think what helped inform my cultural identity it was almost like it fit like a hand in a glove. So my mother's family is from Guyana, so culturally West Indian. And funny enough, even though um, Guyana is predominantly, I don't know, I think it's predominantly Christian. Um, a lot of the people in my community in South Florida were mostly Muslim, who also happened to be West Indian, who also happened to be like South Asian, and like that cultural overlap seemed to mesh well because a lot of the tendencies that Guyanese people had, Muslim people also had. And I mean with the way parents treated their children, with the way they viewed, how you interact with and how you speak to adults, what you do with your life, what you choose to do in school and where you choose to go and how you choose to navigate the personal. So navigating the personal space, my West Indian culture and my Muslim culture or my Muslim identity, they were just like, they fit so well together. And I think that's just because the people practicing the religion, bringing that cultural identity, just melded the two. And it happened so seamlessly, I couldn't even differentiate, right? So it was just, I'm Muslim, but I also happen to be West Indian. Or if it was like, I'm West Indian, but I'm Muslim, right? That was always the identifying marker for me, at least. But again, something that nuanced and complicated did not begin to really make sense to me until I got older, until I interacted with people, especially when I began to like interact with family members who were deemed, outcasts or the rule breakers or the renegades, the folks who did not toe the line. And I was told, you don't want to be like so-and-so when you grow up. I grew up, began interacting with so-and-so, and I learned that they're wonderful people, right? So it's like you step out of that cave and begin to interact with things in a totally new light.
100%. I mean, yeah, what the apostates, as I like to call myself, it's yeah, you realize that people aren't that bad. A big part of me leaving Christianity was realizing that there was better community at a dive bar than there was at church. And I was like, well, this is a weird contrast that like Coke dealers and homeless folk are offering me more grace than people at church. It's it really showed me that there was a lot of projection, I guess, in my experience. It's interesting too, like growing up in South Florida as a Muslim had to there's legitimate concerns probably for your safety identifying as a Muslim. Is that a safe assumption?
I think we were in South Florida, we're safer from that because of the community we were so close to. Now, when you go to like school or when you sort of venture out a little further past your close-knit community, you begin to see that, of course, Islamophobia is always a thing, but then again, so is like the ignorance of like American Islamophobia, which is to lop all brown people together into this one category. If you're brown, you're Muslim. There are no distinguishing features, so you become just this one monolithic thing. So I think racially, it was more so. I'd experienced things because I was West Indian. People would think I was Indian or Hindu or whatever, but you get that. Even though, again, all of these cultural and religious spaces are different from one another. So it wasn't bad, and it wasn't dangerous, but I obviously noticed a shift, especially during, I grew up during the War on Terror era. So yeah. A lot of that came to the surface during that time.
Yeah, I'm sure. And we'll dig into that a little more later. I also wanted to ask you, you kind of like, you hinted at your spiritual identity is much more vague, and less dogmatic, but you still culturally identify as Muslim. Just wanted to ask, like, if there was a specific point when that shifted or if it was more gradual.
It was gradual, you turn 18, 19, 20, you want to do more things. You want to experience the world more. You just want to like bend or dare I say like break the rules. It was definitely a gradual like coming into my own identity as opposed to living this, as opposed to establishing my personhood through like my mother's dogmatic worldview. It was gradual, and you meet people who either ask you to do things to like hang out, or they ask you questions and you don't have the answers to, either about like, like, oh, why you can't stay out late, or why don't you drink, or why don't you want to try this? And then you don't really have answers for those questions the older you get, because you realize there aren't real answers. When you were a child and you get these answers, these are the things you stick to. These are the scripts you abide by. And then you get older and you realize that, I don't really jive with that. Like, this is not going to result in damnation. This doesn't make someone's entire being, worthless or damned. But I would definitely say gradual. It was totally gradual. And again, comes from being in high school, going to college, and then just interacting with people and having those conversations with my father that ultimately ended up informing the conversations I had with like friends and even strangers.
That tracks. Yeah. I tend to see, both can kind of happen. Every now and then there's like a moment of epiphany in someone's story. But I think, yeah, we're all gradual beings in a sense, always learning more. And do you think your experiences as a Muslim like have shaped your decisions to pursue writing, and whether it be in politics, digital media, video game culture, those kind of things? Are they related at all?
No, I don't think so. But, like the article that I wrote just now about like San Andreas and being a Muslim kid, it informs my writing. It's always going to. And I feel like that'll be a topic that would come up. It's going to be a topic I'll continue to write about, like being a Muslim kid and trying to play this, or being, in this space and trying to do whatever. But I think I've always just wanted to write. I always liked writing as a kid, and it just gradually like transformed, and I tried to mold it into something clear and coherent. But no, I actually think more so my ethnic cultural identity, like identifying as a black kid, as a black man, as a black writer, that has more so shaped and influenced my direction as a writer. Because that's, I mean, gosh, there's a student paper at Duke, and when I was at graduate school there, I had like this whole column, and it was just constantly tearing into the Trump administration, and I had a lot of shit to write about. This was like 2018, 2019. So I really ran with it. And I would definitely say over religion, it would be like my cultural or my ethnic identity that continues to propel me forward, because, not enough black writers, forget about black and Muslim writers. They're just, the industry is not diverse enough. And they don't do a good job of spotlighting those stories. So the story that I wrote about being a black Muslim kid playing Grand Theft Auto is totally informed by that religious upbringing. But I don't know that I ever had any intention to like write about that in the past, like a long time ago. A couple of years ago, I was like, okay, these are some cultural stories I want to explore, some personal stories I want to explore. But yeah, for me, it was identifying as a black man in this industry, and it began to fuel my desire to try and break in.
That's awesome. And you're a great writer, and everything you write is awesome. Yeah, it's great. And you write deeply. And I think that's something that's missing. And even when there's, alleged representation in our industry, I feel like it's quite tokenized and watered down and not very deep. And
dude, it's tough. Not tomorrow. In a couple of days, we've got Black History Month. And it's going to happen, bro.
Yeah,
it's going to happen. All of the outlets are going to do the thing, and they're going to write about all the black writers and have all the black writers write articles, and then they stop writing about us.
Yeah,
or they're just like they tap you for when someone gets killed by an officer or just something. You've seen this shit all the time.
Yeah. It's upsetting, and it's yeah. I have questions about that too, as it relates to kind of the intersectionality of discrimination. But I am curious, do you remember the first time you encountered like Islamophobia, specifically just personally?
I mean, the rate at which it happened peaked because of 9/11. Before 9/11, it was like I knew I was a Muslim kid and I knew this was the space that I was being raised in. But to the extent of my identity going beyond just my neighborhood, beyond my community, didn't really hit me until after 9/11. Right. And I think that speaks for everybody, but it really gets amplified then. And that's like in school or in public. And it comes from comments about how you look. And it's so funny when I look back at photos of me as a kid, and I'm just like, wow, I look really brown. Like I look really like Indian. And a lot of it came from like either, bullying in school or comments that people make in public because they're just being assholes or whatever. I remember I was at the flea market with my mother, my aunt, my sisters, and we're, just walking around, and all of the tents, and it's a really big flea market, all the tents have these beams that, essentially prop all of them up, and they're pretty high, but I can jump and like grab one and like swing on it. And I was just being stupid. I was like 12, and I was just fooling around, and I'm running and just grabbing on these stupid bars and swinging. And then my mother and my aunt noticed this man like in the corner of their eye who's sort of like following us from a distance. And they get freaked out, obviously, but it's just my mom, my aunt, my sisters, and myself. My father like worked all the time. My dad was constantly at work. So I guess my aunt, who's a lot more, I don't want to say confrontational or abrasive, but she was more so just like, let's figure out what the fuck is going on. She approaches the guy and asks, like, what's going on? Do you have some kind of problem? Or like what, like she's just trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And he goes, yeah, this kid is like swinging around like a monkey on these, on the bars. And as a kid, I don't know that I grasp the language that was being used. But he was really like super pissed. This old white dude, like super pissed. And at the time I was just wondering why he was upset. And I felt like everything was my fault and all of this shit. But it really shook my mother and my aunt. But I was more so caught off guard by the like rage toward a kid. And then later on, I'm thinking about the language and the implications of using that kind of language on a kid. But I think of that as just like innocuous. All these other things that happen like later on are just words. Thankfully, at least in my life, they've always just been like words or slurs and shit that happens online. Like forget about mentioning the internet world or the video game world. That's a different can of worms because that's like all the time. That sort of vitriol is everywhere. But it really spikes after 9/11. And I remember just thinking to myself, it'd probably be best if I didn't say I was Muslim. I used to like to announce it all the time as a kid. I don't know why. But after 9/11, I'm just like, all right, well, time to keep this under wraps. Let me not say any of this, or at least just tell people, oh, hey, I'm Hindu. I don't know why I would deflect to that, even thinking about like the problematic dynamics of that too. Yeah, anything to sort of avoid confrontation or like potential danger even,
Yeah. And how old were you when 9/11 happened?
I was 11.
Wow.
I was 11. Yeah. It's crazy. Everybody remembers like what happened or where they were at during that time.
Yeah, definitely. Do you feel like how quick was that shift? Was it like overnight that you started being worried or perceiving anything, or did it really take a couple years to realize that like America treats Muslims a lot different than I remember a few years ago?
I feel like that took a couple of months. It took a couple of months to see that because we have these conversations at the mosque. Like I think this is also when the Muslim community, at least the Muslim community that I was in, they begin to have more vocal conversations about this shift in tone and language and like being careful about the things that you say. Like you need to understand what's going on right now in the country. And it's like, of course, I'm not processing all of that. I don't understand all of that. At the time, I was just scared because the language was, we got attacked, and as a kid, you're just like, oh shit, we got attacked. Who's attacking us? What's happening? And so for months, it's like not understanding what that meant, but then also realizing who's being painted as the provocateurs, who's being painted as the people carrying out the attacks, right? And then how far reaching those implications are. But at my mosque, it was really about people trying to be more mindful about the language they use, being mindful when they're walking around in their hijab and in their religious garb. So much shit happened in my neighborhood. Oh my God. I remember like raids. I remember like police raids and stuff, like people just rolling through the neighborhood randomly. People in the congregation were like suspicious of other people who just would show up and think that they were maybe someone undercover. There was like this long running rumor that there was this one individual who people were sure was like someone undercover or trying to do something within the mosque, or trying to, gather some kind of intel. But there's nothing going on. There's like a random local mosque. What information could they possibly be trying to get? But that seemed to make everybody just anxious and scared, and you see the number of people in crowds and at events that were sponsored by and for the mosque begin to shrink, right? The number of people who are present begins to shrink. People are more worried, more concerned. And that's what I began to see over the years, right? So over the couple of months after 9/11 is when I began to see, okay, I'm brown, I'm a Muslim kid, motherfuckers hate me, right? But it took years to realize how much that impacted my community at large. So yeah, that was a really just jarring period too, especially those formative years.
Yeah, it's scary. And to contrast it with my story as, a 9 or 10-year-old in a Christian church, I just want to say the hate for Muslims happened overnight. I mean, like it really was like, it happened on Tuesday, I think. And on Wednesday night church, pastor was talking about, evil Muslims. And it really did not take long in my universe. But it makes sense that the hate would come quicker than the response to the hate, it's weird because it did feel, I mean, again, I was pretty young at the time, but it did feel pretty like, it felt like justified, right? Like it was like, well, this attack, it was almost like, because we were living in at least, especially when you're a kid, you're living in a universe where you think you're in the safest place in the world, and then like all of a sudden you're like, wait, how did another country even get to our country to make an attack? Like that was like the mentality. It was like, how is this even possible? And then to be like, well, these Muslims have been plotting against America forever. And then the Christian world, it was like, because America is a Christian country, like this is what this is all about. And so it was very easy. And of course, a lot of like, there was a balance between the people who were just fine with like hurling slurs. But in my universe, it was much more subtle, right? Like it was in much more spiritualized terms. It was in like, this kind of idea. So I'm wondering too, kind of knowing my side and piecing together your side, do you feel like it was like a, like the tension was rising in any kind of organized way, or did you feel like it was super chaotic growing up Muslim? Like, did you feel like y'all had to be ready to defend yourselves, or was it more just like fear and like confusion? What were some of the emotions of that time?
Definitely fear and confusion. And it was also just like not knowing where things were coming from, right? So I didn't have many Christian or Catholic or just non-Muslim friends who could probably inform me about what was going on. And also I'm young, so again, the time of that period, and when there's this huge, soaring support for the U.S. military industrial complex, this militaristic apparatus that we have operating overseas, the support growing for that, back home is crazy. And then you find yourself trying to figure out like, whose side am I supposed to be on? What am I supposed to say? Like, how do I know the right words? And as a kid, you don't understand any of this shit. You identify as Muslim, you are American. At the same time, you have no idea the political ramifications for what's to come.
Yeah.
The fear and confusion, really, yeah, that was it, man. It was fear and confusion. People are afraid of being harassed and attacked. We had congregants being harassed and attacked, and we're trying to figure out, like, what do we do to protect ourselves? And you obviously, you can't do that thoroughly, because that's only going to amplify, that's only going to exacerbate all of the issues, and put you under further scrutiny, right? So yeah, it was crazy. Just a lot of tension, and again, a lot of it from that fear and confusion, and then also from, like, not knowing where something could come from. You know what I mean?
Right. Like, it wasn't like, the 9/11 conspiracies were happening, like, pretty instantly too. And so, like, yeah, it was in a sense an era of terror, in the sense of it did terrorize a country in more psychological ways than I think anything else. Just the, like,
Absolutely.
And no one really knew a solution and so, like, it makes sense that we were all kind of, as a country, so radicalized to be like, yeah, I guess we got to bomb somebody or kill a dictator. Like, it makes sense that we were like, that was where our mentality went. It was like, okay, who's the Hitler we got to shoot? Like, that was the that was kind of the mentality. And then, of course, you add rumors of weapons of mass destruction. I mean, they capitalized on the fear, and it's not like, it's complex for sure. I don't think it's a black and white situation on how to handle an attack like that. But we certainly did a lot of things wrong, and not just as a government, but even as, like, citizens, like, not fully, like, taking the time to move past the rage to, like, figure out exactly who we were as a country, and why making enemies is never really the first step you should take in any kind of conflict. There's also a lot of weird media portrayal at that time, and I think there still is. And since you and I are both in media, what do you think, like, the media portrayal and public discourse of stereotypes of Muslims, like, how has that affected the Muslim community just here in the US?
I mean, if you just look at the way, I feel like it's just all laid out pretty openly and pretty blatantly too, that, like, the scary brown perpetrator is who is at the heart of all of the films that come out after 9/11 that relate to, like, the military identity of the US, and also this rise in, like, Christian nationalism, right? Like, the moral fiber, the moral fabric, foundation of the country is at stake if we let these, towel-wearing suicide bombers run rampant. And it was that kind of violent, disgusting language in those blanket statements that reduced so much of what Muslim people were experiencing, especially in video games. And I'm speaking a lot from video games because of the rise in popularity in military first-person shooters, all of which I indulged because I played I played video games just constantly. I played all of them, and I enjoyed all of them, and had really no idea the deep-rooted issues that came from these twisted depictions, right? You think about the Call of Duty series, like Ghost Recon, SOCOM, a lot of these military shooters that enable the user a sense of, power over these sort of hapless savages, right? It's all one dimensional. You have that stereotypical headscarf, that red and white headscarf wrapped, you can barely see. And that's another thing too, is there's that separation between, like, identifying with that kind of a perpetrator is they're draped in all of these cloths and masks and wraps that you can't see their face, right? So they're just another faceless enemy for you to take down. And it's been damaging and problematic because that's actually just like the running joke, like the suicide bomber. And that's a lot of what I heard as like racist pejoratives that directed at me and whatnot. And you see it in movies, and it's just terrible, really. And it became more subtle, it became more subtle and more thinly veiled until it was just like a sort of a natural part of the culture.
Yeah, definitely. And it's unfortunate that, I think a lot of people, specifically people of privilege, would like to think this was like a temporary thing that happened in the US, but it's still happening. I mean, it was just a few years ago, I was in urgent care for something, and there was, a woman who had garb on. I don't know if she was Muslim or anything, but the person next to me, older white woman, goes, "Can you believe that?" And I'm like, "What?" And she's like, "Her husband probably makes her do that." And I was just like,
wow.
I was like, probably not. I mean, I don't know. I literally, I was flabbergasted. I didn't know what to say. I was like, and so overtly, and it wasn't like it was, I mean, that hush, it's so bold. And like, yeah, I think there is an interesting tie there to just a dehumanization factor. That like, because there are many different religions who have garb that does either cover face or cover head, like that it almost like privileged Americans took that as like license to then just be awful and dehumanizing. It was like they were rejoicing in an extra excuse to be terrible.
To be terrible.
Yeah.
Just fucking terrible. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Do you think Islamophobia intersects, you've brought up, like, I think you've brought this up actually a couple times now, but maybe describe how does Islamophobia intersect with other forms of discrimination and prejudice in the US?
It really just informs so much of it too, because a lot of it is based on race, also based on politics, right? I think about people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, like these representatives who get targeted for their political views, but also for their identities. So it is so intersectional in that it incorporates all of these progressive, liberal leaning ideologies that you could just not be Muslim, not identify as Muslim, not even be brown, or a person of color. But if you were to support the humanization, right, like the bestowing humanity upon someone who is probably experiencing that vicious Islamophobia, then you could ultimately receive a kind of you can catch strays for that. So it used to be very clear in the 2000s. It was like, you're a brown Muslim kid, or you're just a brown person, you're a terrorist, right? That was like the very fast and loose language. But now it's so nuanced that it even includes the political leanings of someone, right? And don't even get me started on like the birthers and the Barack Hussein Obama, like the guy's Muslim, and all of these things that at the time were heinous, but now you look back and it's laughable, it's memeable, really just like pathetic and despicable. But it has transformed, and I think it's really transformed because of politics, because of this hypervigilance of trying to protect Western civilization, American culture, and of course white supremacy, like to make sure that these white supremacist ideologies remain entrenched, embedded, entwined in all of the normal things in American society, all the normal things that would, effectively undo the normalcy of someone else's life who is not white. But it's transformed. It's transformed into something really heinous and really scary, because it's a lot more calculating. It's a lot more far-reaching and a lot more political. Funny enough, it was political back in the day, but it was like overtly racist and overtly misinformed, right? Because even if you were Sikh, or you spoke Hindi, or you We're celebrating Diwali, like you're a terrorist. Not the same thing. What are you doing? You can't even racism properly. But it was because it was all lopped into one category, and now it's just really transformed.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it any better, especially about how much of this is rooted both in white supremacist ideology, and it does feel like the intentionality has increased in recent years rather than decreased, and that is troubling to say the least. I also think that coming from the Christian world and how obviously this whole podcast critiques Christianity, and like I get hate mail because I'm critiquing Christianity and hate comments and all that good stuff. It's insane to me how often people say you would never do this about Islam because you're afraid they'll cut your head off, and like crazy things like that people will say. And I usually have two responses. One is like, I talk about whatever the hell I want to talk about. Two, I'm certainly not afraid of getting my head chopped off for many reasons. There's many reasons I'm not afraid of that. But also it's not that I'm like against critiquing Islam. I'm just coming from a place of both expertise and also like a worry about what is more relevant to our conversations right now. And it's to me much more. I don't think white supremacy has quite gotten its grip on Islam that it has on Christianity. And the certainly, at least in the US, the nationalist tendencies have not arrived here. If you want to start talking more globally, I think there's more room to talk critique. But I'm like, yeah, my purpose is both born of my experience and expertise, and also like what I think we should be focused on. It's like if Islam has some problematic beliefs, sure, talk about them, but it's way different when, again, what you're referring to, which is this more organized, more like normalizing of just dehumanizing ideologies. That's like what we should be laser focused on, especially as like critics, at least in my opinion.
At the time, too, it was scary because, right, Sharia law was going to pop up. Sharia law was going to make every American woman like dress in a burqa. Like Sharia law was coming after you. It was a pervading, misleading ideology, like argument at the time that couldn't be further from the truth. And then, ironically enough, we have the equivalent, but in this Christo-fascist, white nationalist growing movement in the U.S. that enacts kind of policy with similar power, with similar reach as like the supposed Sharia of the past, right? And you've got things like Project 2025 that's quite literally this right-wing authoritarian agenda to completely reshape the executive branch and to extend those powers to impact and elevate Western civilization. And it's just overt white supremacist agenda making that in the past we were so horrified of something like Sharia, right? And now we have the equivalent for like a Christo-fascist state taking place in 2024.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the trajectory is scary because it's not like something that's being, I mean, again, we just had a Speaker of the House that is literally saying like Christian nationalist things objectively in the open, not hiding it at all. Yeah, it's pretty wild, and the projection is pretty incredible. But I do want to like, just to be fair, in your opinion, when does like Islam become problematic? It certainly has in the past. We would both acknowledge that. But when can it get either extremist or cultic?
I think when that moderation is like undone. And when I say moderation, I mean the extent to which you apply like Islamic law and rule to the present is, I mean, could be damaging for a number of reasons. Like, and what I'm basically saying is you can't really use these dated and old-fashioned means of navigating life and apply them to the 21st century. You can learn maybe like the moral of the story if you've got these religious texts to work off of. But I've always just been very cautious of overindulging antiquated ideas and attempting to apply them to the 21st century, like the kind of command a husband has over his wife or the kind of freedoms that she should be limited to, or the permissions she needs to ask her husband for. None of that stuff is ever anything I jived with, even as a child, when I would hear things about like the music you should listen to, or, like the Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh cards are essentially like demonic artifacts. That shit blew my mind then. It still blows my mind now. And I think that's when it can get problematic, is when these traditional and dated views of the world are applied to today, because we are not in like the times of these prominent religious, often fictional figures existed, right? So to think that you can, in some blanket maneuver, apply that kind of way of living to now, that doesn't work, and it's problematic. It was problematic when I heard it in my mosque, and it's problematic now. Yeah, and especially things like when it comes to identity and sexual orientation, and recognizing like LGBTQIA existence. That needs work. That absolutely needs work, to recognize that people identify differently, and because you don't agree with their lifestyle, or because you don't agree with that person's like life, that does not necessitate like preaching and promoting hateful speech targeted at those kinds of communities. And these are things I would hear in the mosque all the time, either about homosexuality, or you hear about like premarital sex, or you hear about any of the dated, traditional, like antiquated ass views of the world get promoted as righteous if you don't do these things, righteous if you convince someone to not be queer, right? Like righteous to live in a similar capacity to these old figures in Islam. And that's problematic. That's always been problematic. And I think that's really why, personally, I identify more culturally than religiously as Muslim, because too much has changed for me to feel that I can view the world in such antiquated, like antiquated dichotomous black and white viewpoints. Like I just can't. So
yeah, I agree. There's kind of two issues you bring up. Is one, the antiquated nature of it all. Like it's just like, hey, some of this was written before we knew like a lot more about psychology and science and the rest of it. And when people had to dehumanize others because there was a lot more war just kind of going on all the time. But beyond that, too, there's also like this really specific thing that happens when you kind of westernize Eastern religions, like when you kind of like, again, start taking things a little too literally, start taking things as
correct.
For lack of a better way, gospel truth, when you start taking it as like a dogma or a doctrine or a principle, instead of like a message that has multiple meanings for people to find themselves. And like, Western thought just doesn't do well with that kind of thinking, for many reasons, some good, some bad. But yeah, I think two things there's the antiquated nature of it all, and there's also like this like kind of mysticism that Americans just really struggle with in some of these older religions. But yeah, I agree with you, and I think like you can even, but I mean, to be fair, there are things going on currently in the Middle East that have a lot of religious ties to Holy Lands and to other things. That I think like are worth critiquing and are worth pointing to the religion or the religious teachings that these people are using to justify like horrible things. I think is always worth doing, no matter the religion. And I'm partially just saying that to say it's not just Christianity, but to say in the U.S. we need to still keep the focus there because it's been more organized and systemized and used to dehumanize. Do you think there's any positive shifts or changes in public perception and awareness regarding Islam and Islamophobia and Muslims? And if there have been any positive changes, what have they been and how have they happened?
I think it's a lot of like the younger generation coming into the internet age with access to so much more clearer, less misinformed historical information about like the United States, how the U.S. has like strong armed countries, the U.S.'s relations in the Middle East, the United States history in general as just this domineering force that has upended nation states and more liberal and progressive views reaching younger generations. That has absolutely transformed how newer generations are viewing, something like Islam, people like, Muslim people. And I say that because of like the genocide in Palestine. We are seeing more support for Palestinians than we did before, especially because of access to information that we have. There's a lot more transparency, either intentional or not, that we can see. And there's a lot more access to information that I think people are coming into with a lot more open mind. So the things that we used to learn, right? The information that used to get disseminated is being exposed for lacking a lot of truth, right? So I really think it's the newer generations that are stepping up and being like, oh, hey, look, not all Muslims are terrorists, or hey, look, Islam doesn't represent X, Y, Z, or all of these, all the kinds of disinformation that gets circulated. I think the newer generation is quicker to poke holes into, to scrutinize, to put an indictment on Islamophobia in a lot of really insightful and inspiring ways because of their access to information. Granted, there's still just as much, if not even more, I'd say, way more disinformation, but I feel like the younger generations are coming into their own as opposed to having to walk the line and listen to what older generations have tried to indoctrinate them with. So they're just finding shit out for themselves and they're realizing that, whoa, this is really how it is? Holy shit, hold on, wait a minute.
I agree. I think
it's transformed a lot.
I definitely think the opinions are getting a little better. And the public perception and awareness is certainly getting better in these younger generations. I hope that activism follows, though, because there's always like this kind of disconnect between how we talk and how we act.
Correct.
I do worry because the Christian nationalists are better at voting and planning and writing legislation constantly and like doing these kinds of things that are really scary. And young people are really good about going online and shouting about it, which is not a bad thing to do, but it also, requires action. And I just hope that follows and isn't just a little bit performative. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
To push back on that a little bit, I think a lot of the access that we have to things like voting and to things like quite literally getting in there and changing the system from utilizing that right is really, it's really like there are a lot of inequities there. Right.
Definitely.
So a lot of the people who do get to go and vote, who do get to do these things, are often older adults, folks who have access to things like transportation, folks who have access to things like time. Right. So the younger generation, we're caught up in school. I said I'm getting older, so no, they're caught up in school.
We are too.
They're caught up in work. They're caught up in a lot. Right. Yeah. We're getting older. We're still stuck in the same things too. But to your point, I do think there are a lot of things that they are like that avenues beset by all of these inequities that make it more challenging for you to get to the polls, but easier for somebody who, of course, has like an ID, who has transportation, who has time on their hands. And a lot of these older white Christian voters are going to do that because they have all of those things. And the younger folks, we identify differently. We have different means of transportation, different sources of income, few sources of income. And it transforms how that change
100%
comes about. You know what I mean?
It's such a good point, and also very disenfranchised as well. So like the motivation to go, especially if you're in a red state or something like that, can be like what's even the point, because the Electoral College is going to F this up anyway. Like the disenfranchised can be very real and very palpable. So I'm not saying, voting fixes everything and that we shouldn't be shouting. We should be shouting. But it's just, I get a little burned, I think, just on the performative side of things, where it's like people just want to say
absolutely.
the right words.
Yeah, that definitely still exists.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I do think, but again, I think, forward is forward no matter the pace. And some days when I'm feeling positive, I do think we're moving forward. It's just at a snail's pace. And it's scary when, again, like there's just death and destruction almost everywhere you look, especially when you're in our industry and we're looking for it. But what do you think needs to change more systematically? Like, do you, especially when it comes to this, kind of, you think of the First Amendment, right? There's this ideal of religious freedom, but then there's a very specific way the ideal of religious freedom is used now. So what needs to change there?
I don't know that there's a clear answer to this, because we have to amend the way we are perceiving this dated, antiquated text. And I don't mean the Bible, right? Even though that's been edited and transformed as well. I mean, when you look at a right that is so impactful but so opaque, and you see the issues that we have as a result of it, you have to wonder, like, what are we doing wrong with this thing? And I think, to your point about religious freedom, I don't think you should be free to infringe on someone else's personal rights. And I think people wield that and weaponize it and think that it gives them license to do things like withhold business because I don't believe in the things that you're doing with your life. And we're seeing that all the time, like bakers not making cakes for like a queer couple, or someone not doing something because they don't believe in their identity. And I think that's a line that has to be drawn at some point. I don't know how that gets drawn, because you are going to get backlash. The people who are practicing their religion want to feel that they can do so at the expense of someone else, at the expense of their neighbor. And there is no separation anymore. This idea of like separation of church and state, first of all, we don't even know what the fuck that means at this point, because you've essentially got like religious ideologies making their way into schools in a way that makes something like diversity, inclusion, and equity seem problematic, right? So you have to go back to the drawing board. What is religious freedom? Who is building the foundation on which we understand that? How do we enact that? Who is policing this, right? And how do they police it in that way? I don't know that something like that will ever change because of the state of the country and because of the reverence the country has for a text like the Constitution and for a right like freedom of speech and the freedom to practice my religion, but also practice it at the expense of other people. I think that's something has to change in that regard, that the way that I live my life is going to come at the expense of someone else or infringing upon their rights. I don't know that it ever will. I don't want to be a cynic or a pessimist, but just with the way that just the zealotry that exists in the country and the reverence for really dated mythic stories and texts, the way that's just caked into American society, I can't see that really transforming for the better. But it needs to change, that if this thing that I'm going to do religiously to express my religious freedom is going to like hurt someone else or prevent someone else from doing a thing, how should I be allowed to do that? That's so damaging and dangerous. So, yeah, there are too many people who have who view this as beneficial as well. And I'm talking about like the capitalists of the world.
Yeah.
Like this is something they feed into, and helps their bottom line. So
yeah, there's a huge money problem that's tied to this, and there's a huge there's a lot. I mean, it's again the First Amendment, so there's a lot of problems tied to this. But like a big, if I could just magically rewrite the amendment, I would say something to the effect of no religion gets preferential treatment. That's the ideal of religion freedom I wish existed, because instead what ends up happening is, if you say the right religion the right way will give you a free pass to ignore this law, is basically what religious freedom is coming down to. And of course, in the US, the dominant religion is Christianity. And there are certainly cases where, Christianity is given freedoms that other religions are not, but those can be kind of niche and hard to, deconstruct. But generally, I just think it's problematic to say you're free to practice your religion however you choose. I think is just a bad mentality, frankly, because you can pretty much hide anything behind a religion if you try hard enough, and we're seeing that happen.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about Christofascism and Christian nationalism, and you could call it evangelicalism in my book. You can call it about anything. I just say Christianity. Some people think that might be a broad usage, but I'm like, I'd rather just talk about what we're trying to talk about than worry too much about the words. So in your observation, how has the portrayal of Muslims by Christians contributed to their own cultish environment and like continued the negative stereotypes? Do you see that tied directly to Christianity?
I think because I have not been in many Christian spaces. I mean, I'm in the United States. I'm in a Christian space. But because I try to avoid that, I try to avoid those like hyperbolic echo chambers. I don't know. I do know, though, when I see people like representatives like Ilhan Omar, when they get attacked by other politicians in a very relentless and overtly racist and damaging way, I know that this system is protecting those people. So when like conservative or Republican representatives attack Ilhan Omar and scrutinize her a lot more than, say, a former president who fomented insurrection and who was found guilty of a number of sexual assault allegations. You have to wonder, like, how is this system, again, thinking more politically, how does this system protect those type of people, those people who go harder at someone like Ilhan Omar and not so hard on someone like Trump or any of his constituents? Like, it's baffling how political it's become. So now I don't even think about it in the context of like the church anymore. I think about it in the context of Capitol Hill. A lot of these wars are now fought and won in the political space, and they continue to wield subtle, thinly veiled Islamophobia in that regard. And I think it's because of like how stupid the country is with regard to racism. Like, they don't racism correctly. Like, anything brown can be put into this category. They might often gesture to, and I say they, like Republican representatives or leaders might gesture to the post 9/11 era as a cautionary period. Especially if we're not thinking about that frequently, if we're not thinking about like the realities of that time, they might, gesture back to it as a means of reinforcing or trying to garner political support and trying to reinforce that like Christian nationalism. But I'm seeing it way more politically than anything. If I was in more churches, I'd probably be able to hear more.
Yeah. Well, yes. And I think that's worth bringing up is how, kind of mainstream political it's getting. And certainly, I don't know, like I think it was Newt Gingrich in 2012 who said there's a war on Christians in the US and was running his campaign on the promise of like, basically protecting Christians from Muslims and this kind of thing. And, that kind of overt language is kind of frightening when it's in the political sphere, because that's where laws happen. One example I like to bring up, because, the Trump presidency is kind of like the extended version of Lord of the Rings. Like, you forget so much of like all the crap he said and like all this.
And it's really long.
It's really long. But I actually got reminded on my Facebook memories recently, because I was still a Christian when Trump was elected. I did not vote for him, but I was like, I was in the Christian world. A mindset is you, once a president is elected, you support them and you pray for them and you like kind of hope that God will work through them and stuff. And I apparently made a post where I said I wanted to support President Trump, but after this happened, I can't no longer. I want him impeached. I don't think he should be our president, which was a bold thing for me to say, especially as a Christian still. But what's funny is I was like, what did he do? Like, what was I so upset? And I looked and I was like, oh, it was the Muslim ban. That was where I was like, this is insanity. Because he literally proposed that we should ban Muslims from coming into our country. And it's just kind of unfathomable when you think about it, especially a country that says like we have religious freedom to even propose something like that. And again, I think it's so central to what you're pointing out is that that's only to speak to a base. That serves no other function than to like rally a base. And the same base that on Wednesday after 9/11 was saying, get ready, the evil Muslims are coming. You know, the end times are near kind of hints and that kind of thing. You know, I think you can, I think more people actually probably should be going to church and hearing what people are saying. You know, go to a Christian church and really start exposing what is actually happening, because those politicians are capitalizing on those fears and on that rhetoric. That's at least how I see it.
Yeah, and ironically enough, Trump is this reincarnated white evangelical hero. Even though a lot of them have problems with his morals, they still believe he's fighting for their beliefs. And he vocalized that, right? Like Christian values, good Christian values, Western civilization, all of these overtly nationalist, exclusionary terms, they're still going to support that and you know, go to bat for him because he's standing for their values. And that makes you wonder, like, where are those values coming from? Are they coming from the church? Are they coming from like a place of religious relevance? So yeah, I think he is like Trump is like the second coming of all of the politicians who, in a thinly veiled manner, spoke about defending your white evangelical worldview, but now he's saying it more explicitly. So he's just saying the quiet parts out loud. So it's yeah. And that Muslim ban, it's so funny you said that too, because of the many things, I forgot about that. And then there's Charlottesville, and there are all of these things that happen that you forget about because there is another damning inflection point that you have to worry about like who is targeted in that moment. But I think it'll always be there. You know, since 9/11, like the brown boogeyman that is the savage Muslim is always going to be there as the scapegoat to justify yet another totally irrelevant, totally inhumane campaign to just undo and destabilize a nation, some other nation, and to dip within their reservoir of resources that'll inevitably just help prop up this massive military apparatus that the U.S. wields at will, and does so with the full-blown support of most of the nation. Because again, the scary Muslim guy, the scary Muslim woman, the scary like brown group is out there like plotting. With what resources? I don't fucking know. The U.S. took them.
Right. That's really the biggest irony is like, how could they be this organized, as you're saying? But it's not a critical thought. It's again just fear based, as you're saying. I did want to ask, because like I've touted the theory that even like progressive or centrist Christians can still like inadvertently kind of uphold evangelical zealots like through the rhetoric and stuff. But I don't know if that's the same thing that could happen in Islam. And since you're, identifying like culturally as Muslim, I thought you might be able to speak into this. But do you see any parallels between like the cultish control Christian leaders have over their followers, like Muslim leaders might have over their followers? And do those who maybe reject that paradigm either uphold or reject the dogmatic zealots? Like, is that a way of saying don't be an extremist Muslim, or is that a way of saying, or could it inadvertently uphold extremist Muslims? Do you know the question I'm kind of circling?
Unfortunately, my answer is I feel like all religions do this, and all religions have the capacity to do that. And by do that, I just mean sort of prop up this dogmatic zealotry. I think that's just like the nature of worship, right? Because when you worship, when you submit, when you kneel and you bow, there's a complete breakdown that you are having. There's a giving up of your personhood on a spiritual and intimate level that has to tap into zealotry, that has to tap into extremism for you to be able to do that. Okay, because if outside of religion, the only thing I'd probably ever, I've always told myself I would never be able to join a cult, but I don't think I could ever get duped into joining a cult. But I grew up Muslim, and if I stayed in the path that I stayed, I probably would have been a lot more extreme in my views if I didn't just start to open up my mind. Besides Pokemon, I don't think there's any other place or company or entity that could create something as a cult and get me sucked into it. At least I don't think so. But with regard to religion, I just think in Islam, yes. I mean, I see it with a lot of my peers, a lot of my friends that I grew up with who have adopted some really like backward and extreme views about the world. I still don't think they make up a large enough, organization to be problematic or dangerous to the United States. I just think that's the nature of religion. If I'm answering that correctly, I just think like that's still. I think that's just bound to happen. Like if you obsess over and religion is obsession. So you obsess over something long enough, I think you're going to go to bat for it no matter what the fuck happens.
And that's a cult in my worldview. Like that's what's so scary, right? Is like that's where I, and that's kind of the premise, right? Is and why I don't just focus on evangelicalism, although obviously it's like I'm like, keep your eyes there. That's the group to watch right now for sure. And people mishear it sometimes as like me trying to dehumanize people based on their personal beliefs. That's not what I'm really talking about. I don't really care what anyone believes personally. Like I just don't. I like the term spiritually private. It's such a beautiful term. I wish more people were like that. Just had their own personal beliefs that were so personal that you don't even know what they are. I like that. I think that's how more people should be. But the idea of exactly what you're talking about, worship being obsession and worship kind of being a total submission. Like that's kind of just what it ends up being, whether you want it to be or not. Even if you're a pretty friendly person, even if you're someone I love, even if you're someone who I think outside of your religious beliefs are a wonderful person, it's concerning what that belief can turn into and the speed at which the dogma of the day can control you. That's kind of what frightens me about it. But I do think there's something about kind of keeping in mind who the oppressors and the oppressed are in those conversations, and realize that oftentimes groups that are oppressed like need each other in times of distress. Like that's just a thing that needs to happen too. And so a lot of times when the identity is more cultural, it's really more about survival or on the positive side, or it's about dominating on the negative side. And it's important to pay attention to who's doing what there. And my theory, my thesis, the thing I keep poking at is that when it comes to Islamophobia, at least, is that Muslims are just a convenient group for Christians to project onto after 9/11. And now they're just doing it to trans folks, queer folks, and even just woke people. Like wokeism is the big boogeyman now, or the most relevant one now. And I think, the fear of like this Muslim doctrine, like, or like these, quotes they'll handpick from the Quran, or like just like, the 72 virgins or the suicide bomber or whatever stereotype they want to throw at people. Like that's not any freakier than anything in the Bible. As someone with a Bible degree, there is plenty that you could take.
That's true.
So is it too radical to say that the fear that many people have of Muslims should or just would be more aptly applied to Christianity, at least here in the U.S.?
I don't think that's radical at all, because it's happening right now. Like politically, we are seeing like the rise in Christo-fascism across the board. We're seeing a lot more overt and direct language adopted by political figureheads, people who are on a stage saying these things out loud, using religious doctrine as a means of, just complete and utter disenfranchisement across the board. And these conflations and these hyperbolic, like absolutely vitriolic ideas about trans people and queer people, and CRT and all of these concepts that conservatives really have a loose and fast understanding of. We are seeing a dangerous and horrifying rise in this white nationalist, white evangelical, like, we need to take back the country. We need to take back Western civilization from the hands of these liberals, from the hands of these woke people, these progressives who want to globalize everything. It's scary. It is dangerous, and that is not far-fetched. And I think, like, if you just look at the Trump campaign, you can look at politicians before him, from like Reagan to Trump. You can chart this rise in white nationalism, this consistent rise, this consistent like belief and holding on to of white nationalism, of this American patriotism, or thinly veiled white nationalism disguised as American patriotism, but it's become so overt. It's become so clear. Social media, the disinformation and misinformation campaigns are everywhere. All of these arguments are like based in religious ideologies, right? Like, I'm seeing all of these bizarre TikToks about conspiracy theories. And if you look at the 7 deadly sins, if you look at the holidays in the United States, or if you look at the Statue of Liberty and her crown and her torch and all these like satanic worldview, it's crazy. It blows my mind. I don't think it's too radical to say that. I am concerned that the internet is amplifying that too, and sort of speeding up that process, to which we have to be vigilant. We have to see this hyperbolic language for what it is, this vitriolic and divisive language for what it is. I mean, otherwise we're screwed.
Yep. And I also think that there's, just such a level of projection, like the way Christians work themselves up over this secret Illuminati or these secret Satanists that are like controlling everything. I'm like, aren't you guys literally doing some of this? And it's I don't want to be like that much of a jerk. I understand like humans are more complex than just pure villains. But I'm like, yeah, like this is kind of what y'all are doing. And I saw that very clearly, I think, as I got older, remembering that post 9/11 world, and just the Islamophobia that was just in the air as I was like breathing. It's scary to realize how quick they moved on to just something new to project onto, and to me that points to like the larger kind of cultic control they want over. Someone once said, I forget who, I would say who it was, but it talking about like the way people control their homes in Christianity is the way they want people to control the country, and like just like in this abusive and overbearing way. And so, yeah, I obviously don't think I'm too radical either. So I'm glad you agree. Jamal, this was super fun. Heavy stuff, but I appreciate you coming on. If people want to find your writing or like just get to know you better, is there a good website for them to go to, or a good way to find you?
Yeah, I just post my stuff online on my website, jamalmichel.com, and that's basically it. Loved chatting with you, John. I love your work. I love how bold and brave you are in doing having a lot of these conversations, and I just appreciate you putting it out into the world. Seriously.
Yeah, Jamal, you're the real one. You know that. And I love anytime we get to chat, and hopefully we'll get to keep working on stuff later. This is my last season of the podcast. Otherwise, I'd invite you back. But it's I'm sure.
Oh, dang.
I'm sure we'll collaborate.
Well, it's bittersweet.
Yeah, I know, right? It is very bittersweet. But I'm looking forward to the rest, where your writing takes you, and where my writing takes me, and where we'll end up together, hopefully at some point.
Same, man. And I appreciate it. And I look forward to working together with you.
Awesome. Thanks, man. And listener, I'll talk to y'all soon. This is the final season of The Cult of Christianity. But this is not the last time I will be investigating religions and cults. If you'd like to continue to follow my work, go to jverner.com or follow my Substack at johnverner.substack.com. You can also continue to support my work by going to thecultofchristianity.com and subscribing for a giant backlog of bonus content, and stay up to date when my next big project releases. Thank you for listening, subscribing, sharing, reviewing, and as always, keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.